I'm Amy Weirich, District Attorney General. Today, I am releasing the complete Tennessee Bureau of Investigation file into the non-fatal shooting of Martavius Banks by an on-duty Memphis police officer. I requested that the TBI investigate this incident after Memphis Police Department Director Mike Rawlings informed me that officers involved in the shooting had disengaged their body-worn cameras before the shooting. After the investigation was finished, my team reviewed the entire file, the facts and the evidence collected by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Our reason in doing that review was to determine if any state criminal laws had been violated by anyone before, during, or after the shooting of Martavius Banks. After our review of the file, it was our ruling that criminal charges should be filed against Martavius Banks. It was also our ruling that no criminal charges should be filed against the officer who shot Martavius Banks. The Shelby County Grand Jury did indict Martavius Banks, and Martavius Banks pled guilty to those charges. What you are about to watch is a short PowerPoint summary of the facts and the evidence in this case. At 6:23 p.m. on September 17, 2018, Memphis police officers pulled over a motorist on Gill Avenue near Silver Street in South Memphis. This was a traffic stop. The driver was Martavius Banks, who also had outstanding warrants at the time for violation of probation on an assault conviction. The officer advised Banks that his license tags indicated that there was no insurance on the car. The officer then asked Mr. Banks for his license and his registration. This is a photograph of the traffic stop. The officer saw a gun at Banks' side between the front seat and the console. The officer stepped back and said, "Don't move, don't move." At this point, Banks put his car into gear and drove away over the curb. This is body-worn camera. This is a map showing you where the pursuit began and the route that the defendant Martavius Banks took. The shot of Elvis Presley Boulevard at Quinn Avenue. The defendant, Martavius Banks, is in the car that is circled there, driving south on Elvis Presley Boulevard. He ran 2 stoplights and wove in and out of traffic at a very high rate of speed. Here's a video showing that. This is taken from the officer's dash cam. This shows you the nearly 5 miles that Martavius Banks drove at high rates of speed, trying to evade the police and trying to evade arrest. He eventually stopped at 1268 Gill Avenue with officers close behind. The defendant, Martavius Banks, is within that white circle, running for the porch, holding a handgun. When I made it to the top of the stairs, this is a quote from the officer, I noticed his left hand was trying to gain access on the door handle, and as his body turned, I realized his right hand had a weapon in it and had started raising it toward me, and that is when I drew my firearm. There's no video because the officer had turned off his body-worn camera, which is a violation of police policy. This is another shot showing the officer firing at the defendant. Him raising a weapon toward me made me stop running dead in my tracks. He'd already shown that he did not feel like complying with law enforcement. Again, a quote from the officer. When he produced the weapon, I feared that he was going to shoot me, try to take away my life. After Banks was shot, he entered the house and closed the front door. Martavius Banks was struck 5 times, including in the chest, which exited through the back, the left arm, the lower abdomen, and twice in the groin area. This is a shot of the 9mm handgun near the front door at 1268 Gill. It had 1 round in the chamber and it had 5 in the magazine. DNA testing was done on that gun and it came back to Martavius Banks. The officer who fired the shots later resigned. 3 other officers involved in this were given unpaid suspensions, again for violating department policies relative to body-worn cameras, radio procedures, and pursuit policy. These are police policy matters. They are not within the purview of the review of the District Attorney General's office. My review, my responsibility is to determine if state criminal laws were broken by anyone involved in this incident. And it was our determination that they were, that Martavius Banks violated the law of the state of Tennessee. Case was presented to the Shelby County Grand Jury, as I indicated earlier. The grand jury returned an indictment on May 9th of 2019. Count 1 for intentionally evading arrest in an automobile, creating risk of death or injury. Count 2, unlawful possession of a weapon. Mr. Martavius Banks at the time had been convicted previously of a domestic violence assault. He is a prohibited person relative to gun possession. It is against the law for him to be in possession of a gun, and he was that day. Counts 3 and 4 that the grand jury returned were for driving on a revoked license. Those charges were dismissed by our office. This is some of the footage that you've seen earlier showing this 5-mile chase by the police of Martavius Banks at the high rates, weaving in and out of traffic, running red lights. Another footage showing within that red circle, the defendant's car, pieces of his car there in the yellow circle. And count 2, the illegal possession of the firearm that the officer saw when he initially stopped Mr. Banks for the minor traffic stop. And additionally, the gun that was found inside the door at 1268 Gill that had Martavius Banks' DNA on it. He was placed on 2 years probation for these crimes. Additionally, for the crime that he had already pled guilty to and was on probation, he was given an additional 10 months and 12 days of probation for violating the terms of that probation. Why were there no criminal charges against the officer who shot Martavius Banks? The officer's account that Banks had turned toward him with a gun was supported by the evidence. The gun with Banks' blood and DNA on it was found just inside the front door where he fell after being shot. The officer had seen him with a gun previously and seen him get out of the car with the gun and point it toward the officer. His bullet wounds were to the front of his body, not to the back of his body. And the body-worn camera video showed that Banks was running with what appeared to be a gun in hand in TBI-enhanced frames. The officer who fired the shots had turned off his body camera and has since resigned. This again was a violation of Memphis Police Department policy. This is not a state criminal offense. The 3 other officers again were given unpaid suspensions for violating policies in their own terms. Those also, again, are violations of MPD policy. They are not violations of state criminal law.